What if everything you've been taught about the origins of civilization was only half the story? A carefully edited version that left entire empires in the shadows? We are told again and again that human brilliance was born in Mesopotamia, refined in Egypt, perfected in Greece and Rome. But what if, across the vast plains, deserts, and highlands of Africa, there once rose civilizations so powerful, so advanced, that acknowledging them would rewrite the very foundation of history? For centuries, whispers have lingered, of cities of stone rivaling the pyramids, of libraries buried in sand, holding secrets of the stars, of kings whose wealth bent economies to their knees, and of myths that hint at cosmic knowledge older than science itself. Yet these stories were silenced, erased, or dismissed as legend. Why? Because to admit their truth would shatter the Eurocentric narrative that still dominates textbooks today. Tonight, we lift the veil. We will walk through ruins that should not exist, hold manuscripts that should have burned, and confront mysteries that refuse to stay hidden. The question is no longer whether these empires existed, but why their memory was forbidden in the first place. Are you ready to hear what history tried to erase? History is often presented to us as a straight line, a dawn in Mesopotamia, a flowering along the Nile, a refinement in Greece, and a culmination in Europe. But look closer, and you notice gaps, chapters torn away, entire civilizations omitted, voices silenced. Nowhere is this silence louder than in Africa, where countless empires rose and fell, leaving behind ruins, manuscripts, and oral traditions that contradict the neat textbook story. From the very beginning, the way history was written reflected power. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European colonial empires expanded into Africa, they brought with them not only armies, but also a narrative. Africa, they said, was without history. The British philosopher Hegel once declared that Africa is no historical part of the world, dismissing centuries of culture with a single sentence. This kind of erasure wasn't an accident, it was convenient. If Africa had no history, then conquest was not theft, it was civilizing. Yet the physical evidence defies these claims. Archaeologists uncover layers of stone cities, intricate metallurgy, complex farming systems, and trade routes spanning thousands of miles. Still, for much of the modern era, these finds were either ignored or attributed to outsiders. When ruins of Great Zimbabwe were first reported, colonial officials refused to believe they were built by Africans. They proposed instead that ancient Phoenicians or the Queen of Sheba had constructed them. The evidence of African genius was present in the very stones, but the narrative would not allow it. The silences are equally visible in manuscripts and maps. European explorers in the 14th century heard of Timbuktu as a golden city, but when they finally arrived, they downplayed its significance. Manuscripts recording astronomy, medicine, and law were left to decay or stolen into foreign archives. Maps like the 1375 Catalan Atlas depicted African kings enthroned with golden orbs, but later cartographers scrubbed those details away, shrinking Africa into blank space. What once was central to global imagination became peripheral. Science adds another layer to the picture. Genetic studies show complex patterns of migration across Africa thousands of years ago, linking communities from the Rift Valley to the Sahel. These findings suggest long-standing interaction, innovation, and adaptation, a living network of civilizations. Linguistics, too, reveals deep time. The Bantu migrations carried language, agriculture, and metallurgy across half the continent, shaping societies from Cameroon to South Africa. These are not the signs of a silent continent, but of one constantly in motion, creating and reshaping itself. The motif of missing pages is not metaphor alone. It is visible in burned libraries, lost chronicles, and scattered oral histories. Imagine the Library of Alexandria, whose destruction is mourned for erasing Greek wisdom. Yet how many African archives were lost with little mention? In Mali, families hid manuscripts under floorboards during invasions. In Ethiopia, chronicles of kings were copied and recopied, but many vanished in war. Each lost manuscript is a page of history removed, an entire perspective silenced. Even oral tradition bears scars. The griots of West Africa preserved epics of rulers like Sundiata Keita for centuries, but colonial administrators dismissed their songs as folklore, not history. In truth, oral memory carried details about genealogy, law, and cosmology that written records often left out. The very fluidity of oral tradition, its ability to adapt and survive, was what kept memory alive when monuments crumbled. Archaeological imagery deepens the contradiction. Satellite scans reveal the outlines of forgotten roads beneath desert sands. Excavations uncover Chinese porcelain in inland Africa, proof of far-reaching trade centuries before Europeans set sail. Radiocarbon dating of ruins like Great Zimbabwe places them firmly within African chronology, eliminating the colonial myths of foreign builders. Science paints a vivid picture of connection, complexity, and creativity, yet textbooks still present Africa as marginal. The missing pages are therefore not gaps in reality, but in recognition. The story of Africa was never absent, it was hidden behind deliberate silence. It is as if history itself was curated to privilege one side of the story while discarding another. And this act of erasure leaves us not only with a distorted view of Africa, but a distorted view of humanity. If Africa is the cradle of humankind, how can its civilizations be dismissed as peripheral? To confront this silence is to reassemble the fragments. It is to listen to the voices preserved in stone, song, and script. It is to recognize that the story of civilization is not a single thread beginning in Mesopotamia, but a vast tapestry with Africa at its heart. Each missing page we recover does not merely add detail, it rewrites the frame itself. And so, as we step forward, we turn from the silence toward voices long ignored, the forgotten neighbors of Egypt, the Kushite kings and the Aksumite emperors, whose legacies stretch across deserts and seas. Their stories remind us that the missing pages were never blank. They were simply turned face down, waiting for us to lift them again. When the world thinks of Africa's ancient greatness, it almost always begins and ends with Egypt. Pyramids rising from the sand, mummies wrapped in linen, hieroglyphs glittering on temple walls. But if history's lens had tilted just a little further south, the story would have expanded into something far larger. For there, along the middle and upper Nile, and deep into the Ethiopian highlands, other kingdoms thrived. Kush, Nubia, and Aksum, empires that were not Egypt's shadows, but its equals, and at times its conquerors. The kingdom of Kush, centered at Kerma, modern-day Sudan, flourished as early as 2500 BCE. Excavations reveal vast burial mounds, some larger than football fields, filled with grave goods, pottery, and finely crafted jewelry. These finds suggest a wealthy and stratified society, one capable of organizing monumental labor. Kerma was not merely a trading post, it was a kingdom of power that rivaled its northern neighbor. Satellite imagery of the Kerma Basin reveals sophisticated irrigation systems, indicating early mastery of agriculture in a harsh environment. Later, at Napata and Meroe, Kushite kings wore the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. In the 25th dynasty, roughly 747 to 656 BCE, pharaohs of Kush ruled both Nubia and Egypt, extending their influence as far as the Mediterranean. Archaeological images of the temples at Jebel Barkal, with colossal statues and inscriptions carved in hieroglyphs, confirm that Kushite rulers adopted Egyptian symbols of power while blending them with their own traditions. The Kushite pyramids at Meroe, smaller but more numerous than those at Giza, stand today as evidence of a distinct architectural legacy. Recent drone mapping of Meroe shows over 200 pyramid structures clustered together, creating a landscape as awe-inspiring as Egypt's Valley of the Kings. Nubia, often reduced in older histories to a source of gold and arches for Egypt, reveals itself as something far more complex. Archaeological digs have uncovered advanced metallurgy. Nubian iron furnaces dating to the early 1st millennium BCE produced tools and weapons centuries before widespread use in Europe. Scientific analysis of slag deposits shows temperatures exceeding 1,200 dag-Celsius, proof of technological mastery. These ironworks helped sustain powerful armies and contributed to the region's resilience long after Egypt's decline. Then rising in the highlands of Ethiopia came Aksum, one of the most remarkable kingdoms of antiquity. Flourishing between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, Aksum stood at the center of trade networks spanning Africa, Arabia, India, and the Mediterranean. Its obelisks, carved from single blocks of granite, stand like silent guardians, some over 20 meters tall. These monoliths were tomb markers and cosmic symbols, aligned with both earth and sky. Laser scanning of the obelisks reveals precision in carving and transport that remains difficult to explain with the tools of the time. Aksumite coinage tells another story. Beginning around the 3rd century CE, Aksum minted gold, silver, and bronze coins, the first African state outside the Mediterranean to do so. Numismatic studies show coins inscribed in Ge'ez, the ancient script still used in Ethiopian liturgy. Over time, symbols shifted, from pagan motifs of the sun and crescent moon to the Christian cross, reflecting Aksum's conversion under King Ezana in the 4th century. These coins, found as far afield as India, are material proof of Aksum's global reach. Foreign observers confirmed Aksum's prominence. Roman geographers listed it among the great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Persian inscriptions recorded Aksum as an empire of equal standing. Archaeological surveys of Red Sea ports like Adulis reveal warehouses, harbour installations, and amphorae from the Mediterranean, signs of thriving long-distance commerce. Ground-penetrating radar has even mapped ancient streets buried beneath modern settlements, showing how Aksumite urban planning combined grandeur with functionality. Why then are these neighbours beyond Egypt not celebrated with the same reverence? The answer lies less in the evidence and more in the story told afterward. Egypt, through Greek and Roman eyes, became part of Europe's imagined heritage. Kush, Nubia, and Aksum remained other, too African, too independent to fit neatly into that narrative. Their achievements were not less, they were simply excluded. And yet their ruins remain, pyramids scattered across Sudan's deserts, iron furnaces buried in Nubian soil, obelisks rising in Ethiopian skies. Each speaks in silence, reminding us that Africa's brilliance was not confined to the Nile Delta, but radiated across valleys, rivers, and mountains. From these forgotten neighbours, the story widens again. For beyond the deserts and highlands, in the sweeping savannas of West Africa, rose kingdoms of gold and wisdom, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, whose wealth would astonish the medieval world. In the highlands of Ethiopia, where mountains rise like ancient fortresses above fertile valleys, the ruins of one of Africa's greatest empires still stand. Here, colossal stone obelisks pierce the sky, silent monuments to a kingdom that once connected 3 continents. The Kingdom of Aksum, flourishing between the 1st and 7th centuries CE, was not a peripheral state tucked away in Africa's interior. It was a world power, recognized by Rome, Persia, and India, whose influence stretched across seas and deserts, whose legacies still ripple through Ethiopia today. Aksum's rise was written into its geography. Situated near the Red Sea, it commanded access to the port of Adulis, a hub of commerce where merchants from the Mediterranean, Arabia, and South Asia converged. Archaeologists have unearthed amphorae from Rome, glassware from the Levant, and beads from India in Adulis, evidence of Aksum's far-reaching trade. Satellite surveys of the coastline reveal the faint outlines of ancient docks, warehouses, and caravan routes radiating inland. Through Adulis, Aksum exported ivory, gold, obsidian, and exotic animals, even live elephants, and imported silks, spices, and coins. The empire's coinage remains one of its most striking legacies. Beginning around the 3rd century CE, Aksum was the first African kingdom outside the Mediterranean to mint its own coins. These coins bore inscriptions in Ge'ez, one of the world's oldest written languages still in use today, and circulated widely along trade routes. Some coins feature solar and lunar symbols, reflecting earlier religious traditions, while later issues depict the Christian cross, marking Aksum as one of the first empires to adopt Christianity as a state faith under King Ezana in the 4th century. A hoard of gold Aksumite coins found in southern India demonstrates just how far the reach of this empire extended. The obelisks of Aksum stand as the most visible testament to its engineering brilliance. Carved from single blocks of granite, some over 20 meters tall and weighing hundreds of tons, these monoliths were transported and erected with methods still debated by archaeologists. Laser scanning reveals intricate carved windows and doors on their surfaces, suggesting they symbolized multi-story palaces for the dead. The largest obelisk, though toppled, would have stood nearly 33 meters tall, making it one of the tallest stone monuments of the ancient world. Its presence rivals the pyramids in ambition, though achieved with entirely different technology. Beneath the obelisks, excavations have revealed tombs filled with grave goods, ceramics, glass, bronze, and ornaments, testifying to Aksum's prosperity. Recent ground-penetrating radar surveys have uncovered additional burial chambers still untouched, hinting that much of Aksum's history remains beneath the soil. Religion shaped Aksum's identity as much as trade. King Ezana's inscriptions carved in Greek, Sabaean, and Ge'ez announce his conversion to Christianity, making Aksum one of the earliest Christian empires in the world. Ethiopian tradition still claims that the Ark of the Covenant rests in Aksum, housed within the Church of St. Mary of Zion. Whether myth or reality, this belief illustrates how Aksum linked itself to biblical history, weaving sacred narrative with imperial identity. Foreign sources confirm Aksum's power. The 4th century Roman historian Rufinus described Ethiopian Christians with reverence. A Persian inscription listed Aksum as one of the 4 great powers of the world, alongside Rome, Persia, and China. Even the anonymous Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, a Greco-Roman maritime guide, described Adulis as a thriving market, listing goods from distant lands and identifying Aksumite rulers as key players in Red Sea politics. Yet despite its grandeur, Aksum eventually waned. Climate studies of Ethiopian lakes reveal prolonged droughts in the 7th century, likely straining agriculture. Meanwhile, the rise of Islamic trade networks shifted power away from Red Sea routes, isolating Aksum from the wealth of the wider world. By the 10th century, its influence had faded, leaving behind obelisks, coins, and legends. But Aksum was never truly lost. Its traditions lived on in Ethiopia's Christian kingdom, its script continued in Ge'ez, and its myths still shape the nation's identity. Where are you listening from tonight? And does your land hold ruins or legends that still whisper of the past? From the granite highlands of Aksum, our journey now turns west, across savannas and deserts, where golden empires rose in West Africa, Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, their riches dazzling the medieval world and rewriting the very idea of wealth itself. Across the shimmering savannas of West Africa, where the Sahara meets the grasslands, empires of unimaginable wealth once flourished. Caravans stretched for miles across the desert, carrying salt, ivory, kola nuts, and above all, gold. So much gold that it dazzled travelers and reshaped economies thousands of miles away. These were the empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, kingdoms whose names should be etched alongside Rome, China, and Egypt, but which remain absent from many textbooks. Together they formed what historians call West Africa's Golden Age, a period that challenges every assumption about Africa as a land without history. The first of these great powers was the Empire of Ghana, not the modern nation of Ghana, but a kingdom that thrived between the 6th and 13th centuries in what is now southeastern Mauritania and western Mali. Arab chroniclers, such as al-Bakri, described Ghana's capital as a city divided into two halves, one for the king, with palaces decorated in gold, and another for Muslim merchants, filled with mosques and bustling markets. Archaeological excavations at Kumbi Saleh reveal traces of urban planning, wells, and trading quarters, suggesting a thriving metropolis of tens of thousands of people. Ghana controlled trade routes that connected the goldfields of West Africa with the salt mines of the Sahara, creating a network of exchange that reached as far as North Africa and the Middle East. When Ghana declined due to internal conflict and shifting trade routes, the Empire of Mali rose in its place. Founded by the legendary Sundiata Keita in the early 13th century, Mali became one of the largest and wealthiest empires in the medieval world. Its territory stretched from the Atlantic coast deep into the interior, encompassing fertile farmlands along the Niger River. Mali's rulers built their power on control of gold mines at Bambouk and Wangara, as well as the lucrative trade of salt, a commodity as valuable as gold in desert societies. Mali's fame reached its zenith under Mansa Musa, whose pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 became one of the most extraordinary spectacles in world history. Contemporary reports describe a caravan of 60,000 men, 12,000 slaves, and hundreds of camels carrying so much gold that the markets of Cairo were destabilized for a decade. The 1375 Catalan Atlas, one of Europe's most famous medieval maps, depicts Mansa Musa seated on a golden throne, holding a gold orb, a visual testament to his status as the richest man the world had ever known. Scientific analysis of medieval Arabic sources confirms the shockwaves his pilgrimage sent across the Mediterranean, inspiring both awe and envy. But Mali was not just about wealth. Its true glory lay in its intellectual life, centered in Timbuktu. By the 14th century, Timbuktu housed great centers of learning such as the Sankore and Jingwereba madrasas. Thousands of manuscripts filled libraries, covering topics as diverse as astronomy, medicine, law, mathematics, and poetry. Aerial images of Timbuktu today reveal the remains of these mud brick institutions, still standing as fragile witnesses to a time when West Africa was a beacon of scholarship. Some manuscripts, now digitized, contain star charts, medical treatises, and commentaries on philosophy, demonstrating intellectual achievements equal to any in medieval Europe or the Islamic world. As Mali waned in the 15th century, its mantle was taken up by the Empire of Songhai, which became even larger and more powerful. With its capital at Gao, Songhai controlled vast stretches of the Niger River and dominated trade across the Sahel. Under rulers like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, Songhai developed a highly organized administrative system. Provinces were governed by appointed officials, tax systems were codified, and standing armies patrolled trade routes. The sophistication of Songhai is visible in records left by travelers such as Leo Africanus, who visited in the early 16th century. He described bustling cities with markets filled with textiles, horses, spices, and manuscripts, as well as schools where thousands of students studied law and theology. Excavations at Gao and Gennargeno uncover trade goods ranging from North African ceramics to beads from as far away as India, proving the cosmopolitan nature of these West African cities. Religion also played a central role. Islam spread through trade and pilgrimage, blending with indigenous traditions to create unique forms of expression. Mosques in Timbuktu and Jannah, built in distinctive Sudano-Sahelian style with mud brick and wooden scaffolding, remain among the most iconic monuments of African architecture. The Great Mosque of Jannah, often called the largest mud brick building in the world, stands as a living symbol of the fusion between spiritual life and architectural genius. What makes these empires so extraordinary is not only their wealth, but also their resilience in harsh environments. Controlling trade across the Sahara meant mastering one of the world's most unforgiving landscapes. Caravans relied on a sophisticated system of way stations and wells, knowledge passed down for generations. Recent archaeological and satellite studies trace ancient caravan routes like faint scars across the desert, proving the scale of West Africa's commercial network. And yet, despite their magnificence, the memory of these empires was deliberately diminished. Colonial-era textbooks barely mentioned them, if at all. The wealth of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai was reduced to anecdotes, their cities ignored, their scholars forgotten. Only in recent decades have African historians, archaeologists, and manuscript custodians begun to restore their place in world history. The golden kingdoms of West Africa remind us that prosperity and knowledge were not confined to Europe or the Middle East. They were alive in Africa, shining brightly in desert capitals where gold, salt, and wisdom flowed in equal measure. But among these golden stories, one name rises above all: Mansa Musa. His pilgrimage shook the medieval world and left behind a legend that still captivates today. To understand just how one man could embody both the wealth and mystery of Africa's golden age, we must step closer to his story. Across the sands of the Sahara, in the year 1324, a spectacle unfolded so dazzling that it became the talk of continents. At its centre was one man, Mansa Musa, the ruler of Mali. He was not merely a king, he was a legend, a figure whose wealth was said to eclipse that of any ruler before or since. His pilgrimage to Mecca, the Hajj, became a journey that reshaped economies, astonished foreign courts, and left an imprint on maps, chronicles, and memory itself. Mansa Musa ascended to power in 1312 CE, at a time when Mali was already an empire of immense size and wealth. Stretching from the Atlantic Ocean to the borders of modern Niger, Mali controlled fertile farmlands along the Niger River, as well as the crucial gold mines of Bambouk and Wangara. In an age when gold was the foundation of global trade, Mali sat directly atop its greatest sources. Historians estimate that during his reign, Mali may have supplied nearly half of the world's known gold. Scientific studies of medieval trade records show spikes in gold circulation across the Mediterranean and Middle East that align precisely with Musa's era, underscoring just how central his empire was to global commerce. But it was Musa's pilgrimage that immortalized his name. Setting out in 1324 with a caravan of staggering proportions, he brought with him an estimated 60,000 people, soldiers, attendants, scholars, merchants, and 100 camels carrying hundreds of pounds of gold dust each. Chroniclers such as Al-Umari and Ibn Khaldun recorded details with astonishment. Slaves dressed in fine fabrics, horses adorned with golden trappings, and gifts so lavish that entire economies trembled. When Musa passed through Cairo, he distributed so much gold in alms and gifts that the value of gold itself collapsed. The market glut depressed prices for over a decade, a phenomenon confirmed by economic historians who trace fluctuations in North African currency to Musa's visit. Beyond wealth, the pilgrimage was also a statement of piety and power. By undertaking the Hajj, Musa aligned Mali with the wider Islamic world, forging connections with scholars, merchants, and rulers from Cairo to Mecca. He recruited architects and jurists to return with him, including the renowned Andalusian architect Ishak al-Tuejin, who helped design the Djingariba Mosque in Timbuktu. Musa's journey was thus not only a spiritual act, but also a diplomatic mission and a cultural exchange on a grand scale. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, one of Europe's most famous medieval maps, illustrates Musa enthroned, holding a golden orb, his crown gleaming above the Sahara. This image is not a mythic invention, but a contemporary acknowledgement of his renown. European cartographers who had never seen Musa nonetheless placed him at the centre of Africa, a symbol of unbounded riches. The very inclusion of Musa on a European map reflects how his fame travelled beyond Africa and the Islamic world, becoming part of a global imagination of wealth. Yet Musa's legacy is not simply measured in gold. On his return, he invested heavily in transforming Mali into a beacon of learning and faith. Timbuktu, already a centre of trade, blossomed into a hub of scholarship. The Sankore University, which Musa expanded, attracted students and teachers from across Africa and the Middle East. Manuscripts from this era, some still preserved today, cover mathematics, astronomy, law, and medicine. Aerial and satellite surveys of Timbuktu reveal the dense networks of urban planning, mosques, schools, markets that Musa helped cultivate. Musa also strengthened Mali's infrastructure, commissioning mosques and palaces in Gao and other cities. Oral traditions describe how Musa's wealth allowed him to maintain vast armies and to administer justice through a sophisticated system of governors and local chiefs. Archaeological surveys along the Niger River confirm the scale of urban centres during his reign, uncovering pottery, coins, and imported goods that attest to Mali's prosperity and its role in global trade. How rich was Mansa Musa? Estimates vary wildly, but modern economists attempting to adjust for inflation suggest his fortune would equal hundreds of billions of dollars today. But perhaps the truest measure of his wealth is not material. It lies in the enduring image of a ruler whose generosity altered economies, whose journey connected continents, and whose vision laid foundations for cultural and intellectual growth. And yet, Musa's grandeur carried shadows. His display of wealth drew envy from rival powers. His empire, while magnificent, would not endure forever. Within a century, Mali began to fragment, and its place as the supreme power of West Africa gave way to Songhai. But Musa himself remained etched into memory, a symbol of the heights African empires achieved and of how much of that story remains hidden. The pilgrimage of Mansa Musa was not the end of West Africa's golden age, but its radiant centre. What came after was both expansion and decline, as Mali's glory was inherited by another titan, Songhai, a kingdom even larger and more ambitious, whose rulers sought to turn gold and wisdom into an empire of unprecedented scale. On a plateau in the heart of southern Africa, rising above valleys of acacia and baobab, lie the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, a city of stone that once rivaled the grandest capitals of the medieval world. Its massive granite walls twist across the landscape like the remnants of some primeval fortress. Built without mortar, the blocks fit together with such precision that they have withstood centuries of storms, erosion, and human neglect. These walls are not silent, they are voices in stone, testifying to a civilization whose brilliance was denied for generations. Great Zimbabwe flourished between the 11th and 15th centuries CE during the height of the African Iron Age. Covering an area of more than 700 hectares, it was once home to as many as 20,000 people, a scale that rivaled European cities of the same era. Archaeologists divide the site into three main areas: the hill complex, the Great Enclosure, and the valley ruins. Each tells a different part of the city's story. The hill complex, perched atop a granite outcrop, likely served as a royal residence and spiritual centre. Among its terraces and stone passageways are traces of shrines and ritual spaces, suggesting that rulers here were not only political leaders, but also mediators with the ancestors. The vantage point offered both security and symbolic power, a high place overlooking the valley below. The great enclosure is the most iconic structure. Its outer wall, stretching over 250 meters in circumference and rising up to 11 meters high, is the largest single ancient structure south of the Sahara. Within it stands the mysterious conical tower, a solid stone monument over 9 meters tall. Scholars debate its meaning. Some see it as a granary symbolizing fertility and abundance. Others interpret it as a ritual or political symbol of authority. Whatever its function, its very presence radiates power, a statement carved in granite. The valley ruins, scattered across the surrounding plain, consist of smaller enclosures, houses and workshops. Excavations here reveal the daily life of Great Zimbabwe's inhabitants, iron smelting furnaces, pottery kilns, and evidence of textile production. Soil analysis shows extensive agriculture, including sorghum and millet, sustained by advanced farming techniques. This was not a city isolated in its splendor, but one sustained by skilled labor and careful management of land and resources. The city's wealth came largely from its control of trade in gold and ivory. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of gold working on site, including crucibles and molds. Most striking are the trade goods found far from Africa: Chinese porcelain, Persian glassware, and Arabian beads unearthed within the ruins. These artifacts, confirmed through laboratory analysis, prove that Great Zimbabwe was plugged into vast international networks stretching across the Indian Ocean to Asia and the Middle East. Through coastal ports like Sofala and Kilwa, its gold-fueled global commerce, finding its way into coins, jewellery, and treasuries far beyond Africa. Colonial discovery of these ruins in the 19th century was met not with awe for African builders, but with denial. Early European explorers, unable to reconcile their prejudices with the evidence, proposed fantastical theories. They attributed the city to Phoenicians, Arabs, even King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. For decades, colonial governments suppressed archaeological findings that pointed clearly to African origins, because acknowledging them undermined the myth of Africa as a land without civilization. But science eventually dismantled these myths. Carbon dating of wood and charcoal fragments confirmed the medieval timeline. Comparative analysis of pottery linked Great Zimbabwe to regional traditions, not foreign imports. Satellite mapping has revealed the broader scale of settlement, showing patterns of stone walls and enclosures hidden beneath vegetation, confirming the city's vast reach. UNESCO now recognizes Great Zimbabwe as a World Heritage Site, calling it a masterpiece of African architecture and statecraft. Symbolism also runs deep in these stones. The Zimbabwe birds, carved soapstone figurines found atop monoliths within the ruins, have become national emblems, appearing on the flag of modern Zimbabwe. Their exact meaning is debated. Some see them as totemic guardians, others as representations of the connection between rulers and the spiritual world. Either way, they demonstrate that the builders of Great Zimbabwe encoded meaning and identity into their art, just as surely as they did into their walls. Even the construction techniques themselves speak of ingenuity. Built entirely from locally quarried granite, the walls were created using a dry stone method. Blocks were carefully shaped and layered, with slight inward tilts to stabilize the structures. Recent 3D laser scans of the walls show complex curvatures and buttressing techniques, proving that the builders were master engineers. Without mortar, these structures have endured longer than many medieval castles bound by cement. Great Zimbabwe did not last forever. By the 15th century, shifts in trade routes, environmental stress from overgrazing and deforestation, and political fragmentation weakened the city. Its inhabitants dispersed, and power moved to successor states such as Mutapa. Yet the ruins remained, massive and unyielding, daring anyone to forget. To stand among the granite walls today is to feel a presence both haunting and proud. The silence of the ruins is heavy, but it is not emptiness. It is resistance, a reminder that history can be obscured but never erased. Great Zimbabwe speaks against centuries of denial, declaring in stone what words tried to suppress. Africa built, Africa ruled, Africa thrived. From these enduring walls, the story of Africa's forgotten greatness continues further south and east into other hidden cities and trading states, Mapungubwe, Kilwa, and the Swahili coast, whose ruins, like Zimbabwe's, shimmer with the memory of empires lost to time. Across the rolling savannas and mist-covered highlands of southern and eastern Africa lie traces of once mighty centres of power. Today, they may appear as scattered ruins, collapsed walls, or faint outlines visible only from the sky. But centuries ago, they were bustling cities connected by rivers, trade, and ocean winds. Among them were Mapungubwe, Kilwa Kiziwani, and the Swahili coast city-states, each thriving in its own way, and each embodying a chapter of Africa's story long ignored or dismissed. The Kingdom of Mapungubwe, flourishing between the 11th and 13th centuries in present-day South Africa, is often considered the first stage of the Southern African state tradition later embodied in Great Zimbabwe. Situated on a sandstone hill at the meeting of the Limpopo and Shash rivers, Mapungubwe commanded fertile land and access to trade routes that linked the interior with the Indian Ocean. Excavations reveal a society with clear social stratification. Elites lived atop the hill in stone-built enclosures, while commoners resided in the surrounding plains. Among the most iconic finds is the golden rhinoceros of Mapungubwe, a delicate artifact crafted from thin sheets of hammered gold wrapped around a wooden core. This small but profound piece, now preserved in a museum in Pretoria, is a symbol of both craftsmanship and spiritual meaning. Scientific metallurgical analysis shows the gold was locally sourced, evidence of advanced mining and refining techniques. Archaeologists have uncovered thousands of glass beads at Mapungubwe, many originating from India and the Middle East. Isotope analysis of these beads confirms long-distance trade stretching across the Indian Ocean centuries before European explorers arrived. Pottery shards with stylistic influences from both local traditions and imported designs further prove Mapungubwe's cosmopolitan nature. Far from an isolated settlement, this kingdom was part of a vast commercial web, feeding into the prosperity that later culminated at Great Zimbabwe. If Mapungubwe represents the inland node of this network, then the Swahili coast city-states represent its maritime glory. Stretching from modern Somalia to Mozambique, these city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Lamu, Sofala, and others, thrived between the 10th and 16th centuries as centres of trade, blending African, Arab, Persian, and Indian influences. Their architecture still survives in coral stone mosques, palaces, and fortifications. At Kilwa Kisiwani in Tanzania, the ruins of the Great Mosque and Husuni Kubwa Palace testify to immense wealth and ambition. Built from coral blocks cemented with lime, these structures were unlike anything else in sub-Saharan Africa, reflecting a fusion of local building traditions and Indian Ocean styles. Travellers who visited the Swahili coast were stunned. Ibn Battuta, the Moroccan explorer, described Kilwa in the 14th century as one of the most beautiful and well-constructed cities he had ever seen, its markets overflowing with goods, its rulers adorned in fine cloths. Archaeological surveys confirm this picture. Coins minted in Kilwa have been found as far away as Oman and India. Excavations at coastal sites reveal shards of Chinese porcelain from the Yuan and Ming dynasties, Persian ceramics, and Indian beads, demonstrating the scale of intercontinental commerce. Recent underwater surveys off the Tanzanian coast have even located remnants of ancient harbours and anchor stones, proof of a maritime tradition that connected Africa directly with Asia. The Great Lakes region also held its share of forgotten states. In present-day Uganda, Rwanda, and Burundi, powerful kingdoms such as Buganda and Bunyoro developed intricate systems of governance. Though their monumental architecture was less enduring than stone cities, their political sophistication was preserved through oral history. These kingdoms maintained complex hierarchies, centralized monarchies, and networks of tribute and trade. Archaeological digs around Lake Victoria have unearthed iron-smelting sites, terraced agriculture, and settlement patterns that reveal dense populations supported by advanced farming techniques. Pollen analysis from lakebed cores indicates centuries of landscape management, showing how these societies adapted to and shaped their environment. What ties all these places together is their integration into global systems, from Mapungubwe's gold travelling eastward to Kilwa's merchants trading ivory and slaves across the Indian Ocean. Africa was deeply woven into the medieval world economy. And yet, for centuries, the narrative denied African authorship. Colonial archaeologists insisted the Swahili cities were built by Persians or Arabs, dismissing the evidence of local African agency. This myth was shattered in the mid-20th century, when careful excavations revealed continuous cultural layers connecting coastal urbanism to African roots stretching back centuries. Scientific tools continue to peel back layers of erasure. LiDAR scans along the Limpopo Valley show patterns of ancient stone enclosures invisible to the naked eye, expanding our understanding of Mapungubwe's reach. DNA analysis of skeletons from Swahili coastal cemeteries reveals mixed ancestry, African, Persian, and South Asian, confirming centuries of intermarriage and cultural blending rather than simple foreign domination. Remote sensing along East Africa's coast has revealed submerged harbour installations, suggesting even larger networks of maritime activity than previously imagined. These discoveries force us to rethink. Africa was not waiting for Europe's so-called Age of Discovery. It had its own golden ports, its own inland capitals, its own intellectual and political systems. Its wealth did not merely flow outward, it shaped the world. Chinese porcelain on African soil and African ivory in Chinese palaces are two sides of the same story. And yet, despite their brilliance, many of these cities eventually declined. Kilwa collapsed under Portuguese cannons in the early 16th century. Mapungubwe faded as Great Zimbabwe rose. Political rivalries, shifting trade routes, and environmental stress left once thriving centres in ruin. But the stones remain, the beads endure, the legends still echo. These cities are not lost, they are waiting for us to listen. From the forgotten cities of the south and east, our journey now returns to the desert heart of West Africa, where manuscripts lie hidden in trunks and sand, preserving knowledge once called forbidden, a legacy of words as enduring as stone. Deep in the Sahara Desert lies Timbuktu, a name that for centuries stirred the imagination of traders, explorers, and poets. To the outside world, it was a city of myth, whispered of as a golden capital at the edge of the known world. But the true wealth of Timbuktu was not its gold, though Mali and Songhai overflowed with it, but its knowledge. Within its mosques, schools and homes, scribes and scholars produced and preserved tens of thousands of manuscripts. These fragile pages, written in ink on parchment and paper, contained astronomy, medicine, mathematics, philosophy, and law. They formed one of the greatest intellectual treasures of Africa, a treasure almost erased, but miraculously preserved. At its height between the 14th and 16th centuries, Timbuktu was home to three great centres of learning, Sankore, Jingareba, and Sidi Yahya. These were not universities in the modern sense, but scholarly communities where teachers, students, and scribes debated ideas, copied texts, and spread knowledge. Oral accounts tell us that students could study for 10 or 20 years, specializing in law, theology, or the sciences. Some estimates suggest that libraries in Timbuktu may have contained up to 400,000 manuscripts. Aerial images of the old city show dense clusters of mud brick structures, homes that doubled as archives, where families guarded collections for centuries. The manuscripts themselves are extraordinary. Astronomy texts describe the movement of the stars, calculating eclipses and planetary cycles. Some diagrams show celestial charts that align with oral traditions such as the Dogon knowledge of Sirius, raising questions about how ancient African scholars perceived the cosmos. Medical treatises describe herbal remedies, surgical techniques, and diagnostic methods rooted in both Islamic and local traditions. Legal documents outline contracts, court rulings, and taxation systems, offering rare insight into governance and daily life. Poetry flourishes too, some verses celebrating rulers, others reflecting on love, faith, or the desert itself. Scientific analysis has revealed the depth of this intellectual tradition. Carbon dating of manuscripts places some as early as the 12th century. Ink composition studies show mixtures of plant extracts and minerals, proving the existence of a sophisticated craft economy around writing. Conservation scientists using multispectral imaging have uncovered faded words invisible to the naked eye, recovering lost passages without touching the fragile parchment. Digital projects today are photographing thousands of pages, making them accessible worldwide while preserving the originals in climate-controlled vaults. Yet for centuries, these manuscripts were hidden from view. During Moroccan invasions in the late 16th century, many libraries were destroyed or dispersed. Families smuggled texts into the desert, burying them in chests or hiding them in caves. In the colonial era, European administrators downplayed their significance, insisting Africa had no written tradition. Even in the 20th century, scholars often ignored the collections, treating them as exotic curiosities rather than a vast intellectual record. The most dramatic chapter came in 2012, when militants threatened Timbuktu during conflict in Mali. Libraries such as the Ahmed Baba Institute, housing tens of thousands of manuscripts, were at risk of destruction. Local archivists and families responded with quiet heroism. Under cover of night, they smuggled texts out of the city in rice sacks, canoes, and donkey carts. Thousands were saved, a testament to the unbroken chain of guardianship stretching back centuries. Why was this knowledge considered forbidden? Not because the texts themselves were dangerous, but because they contradicted the dominant narrative. They proved that Africa had a written scholarly tradition, that Africans studied astronomy, law, and medicine as deeply as any culture. To admit this was to dismantle centuries of prejudice. By calling Africa a land without history, colonial powers justified conquest. By ignoring Timbuktu's manuscripts, they kept alive the myth of African silence. But the manuscripts whisper a different truth. They tell us of scholars debating jurisprudence in courtyards shaded by acacia trees. They reveal trade contracts that connected Timbuktu to Cairo, Marrakesh, and even distant Venice. They show a world where knowledge itself was currency, copied carefully by hand, passed from teacher to student, generation to generation. Some texts hint at ideas that feel startlingly modern. Mathematical manuscripts describe geometric principles used in architecture. Scientific treatises mention concepts of hygiene and contagion centuries before such ideas became standard in Europe. The integration of astronomy with agricultural cycles shows a keen awareness of environmental rhythms, knowledge essential for survival in harsh climates. Today, efforts to preserve and digitize these manuscripts are reshaping our understanding of African history. Organizations work with Malian families to catalogue and protect private collections, some still hidden in trunks beneath earthen floors. Digital archives accessible online allow scholars worldwide to explore these texts. Each page scanned is another piece of the missing puzzle returned to view. The story of Timbuktu's libraries is not just about books, it is about resilience. For every invasion, every burning, every dismissal, there was someone who refused to let the words vanish. The guardians of these manuscripts, often ordinary families, understood that they were protecting not only ink and parchment, but identity itself. From the sacred libraries of Timbuktu, the trail of memory leads deeper still, into myths, symbols, and oral traditions where stories of gods, stars, and ancestors carry echoes of knowledge that defies simple explanation. In these tales, the line between history and cosmology blurs, suggesting that what we call myth may in fact be another form of record waiting to be understood. When night falls over the African savannah, the firelight flickers, and voices rise in chant and story. In a continent where written records were often destroyed or dismissed, oral traditions carried the weight of memory. These stories, epics, proverbs, myths, and chants became living archives. They were history, philosophy, astronomy, and law, folded into narrative. To dismiss them as folklore is to misunderstand them, for in their rhythm lies forbidden knowledge, fragments of cosmic memory, codes of survival, and echoes of civilizations that might otherwise have been erased. One of the most famous examples comes from the Dogon people of Mali. For centuries, their oral traditions described the star Sirius not as a single light, but as a system with a hidden companion, a small, dense star orbiting in a cycle of 50 years. This companion, now known as Sirius B, was confirmed by modern astronomy only in the 20th century with advanced telescopes. How did the Dogon preserve this detail without instruments? Scholars debate whether the knowledge came from ancient contact with Islamic astronomy, or whether it points to even older traditions predating written science. Either way, the oral tradition carried scientific detail that startled researchers. The Zulu people speak of the Chitauri, sky beings who came to shape humanity. Among the Yoruba, myths tell of Orunmila, the deity of wisdom, who gave humanity the Ifa divination system, a complex knowledge structure that encodes mathematics, binary patterns, and cosmology. Anthropologists studying Ifa have noted its striking resemblance to computer coding. 256 Odu signs, representing combinations of possibilities, a symbolic system that contains layers of logic and probability. What appears to outsiders as myth can, on closer examination, be seen as a sophisticated intellectual framework. Symbols carved in stone also testify to this hidden knowledge. Across West Africa, the Adinkra symbols of the Akan people capture philosophical ideas. Sankofa, the bird turning backward, symbolizes the wisdom of returning to the past to build the future. Gaia Nyame, the spiral of divine supremacy, encodes cosmological ideas. These symbols were not mere decoration. They appeared on textiles, architecture, and ritual objects, embedding ethical codes and memory into daily life. Similarly, rock art in the Sahara's Tassili N'Ajjer plateau depicts dancers, animals, and enigmatic shapes that some interpret as star maps or shamanic journeys. Satellite imagery has revealed alignments between certain rock art clusters and celestial events, suggesting an ancient awareness of astronomical cycles. The griots of West Africa carried entire epics in memory. The Epic of Sundiata, recounting the rise of Mali's legendary founder, has been performed for centuries. Each griot memorized not just words but tone, gesture, rhythm, transmitting history with performance as well as language. Modern researchers have recorded versions of the epic spanning thousands of lines, showing consistency across centuries despite oral transmission. Such endurance challenges the assumption that oral tradition is fragile. In reality, it was a technology of resilience, designed to survive even when books burned. These myths and traditions also encode ecological knowledge. Among the Shona of Zimbabwe, stories describe ancestral spirits tied to the land, teaching respect for rivers and forests. In East Africa, oral traditions recount cyclical droughts and floods, functioning as historical memory of climate change long before modern science. Paleo-environmental studies of lake sediments in the Rift Valley confirm shifts in rainfall patterns described in oral accounts, proving that story and science often converge. Colonial scholarship, however, dismissed much of this as primitive. Early anthropologists catalogued myths as curiosities rather than as records of knowledge. The assumption that writing was the only valid form of history blinded generations to the depth contained in oral systems. Yet modern approaches, from linguistics to digital humanities, are beginning to decode these traditions as structured repositories of information. Computer models of oral epic transmission show remarkable stability over time, while ethnographic work demonstrates how ritual performance preserved not just memory but identity. What makes these traditions powerful is their adaptability. Unlike stone or ink, oral tradition evolves with each generation, allowing memory to survive even in the face of disruption. When libraries were burned and monuments fell, myths continued to speak, and within them, fragments of what colonialism tried to erase persisted. Star knowledge, genealogies, political structures, and cosmological visions. But they are also layered with mystery. Were the Dogon's insights into serious coincidence or a survival of knowledge from ancient scholars? Do the Efa divination patterns represent proto-mathematics or simply symbolic spirituality? Are the rock carvings in the Sahara maps of constellations or ritual abstractions? We cannot know for certain. Yet the possibility itself reminds us that myth and science are not always opposites. Sometimes they are two languages telling the same story. Symbols, myths, and oral traditions expand our definition of history. They remind us that the past is not only carved into stone or pressed into clay, but spoken, sung, and performed. To listen is to recover the voices that written history refused to hear. From these voices, our path now turns into the darker chapter, the colonial era, when much of Africa's memory was deliberately erased, distorted, or silenced. But even then, fragments endured, waiting for rediscovery. In the 19th century, as European explorers and colonial powers pushed deeper into Africa, they did not merely seize land and resources. They also seized control of memory. The conquest of Africa was accompanied by the conquest of history, a rewriting of the past that denied Africans their own civilizations. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe, the manuscripts of Timbuktu, the oral traditions of the griots, all were either dismissed, distorted, or attributed to outsiders. Colonialism was not only an economic and political project, it was an epistemological one. It created silences where voices once rang clear. The erasure began with ideology. European philosophers such as Hegel openly claimed Africa had no history. In his Philosophy of History, he wrote that Africa is no historical part of the world. Such statements were not careless opinions. They became foundational justifications for imperialism. If Africa was deemed timeless, stagnant, or ahistorical, then colonial conquest could be framed as bringing progress. This narrative entered schoolbooks, museum labels, and academic lectures, shaping generations of thought. Concrete examples show how this ideology played out. When explorers reached the ruins of Great Zimbabwe, their scale was undeniable. But instead of crediting Africans, colonial administrators claimed the city must have been built by Phoenicians, Arabs, or even biblical figures like King Solomon. Excavations were deliberately manipulated. In 1902, Cecil Rhodes' government appointed archaeologist Richard Hall to investigate Great Zimbabwe. Hall cleared away archaeological layers without care, destroying valuable context and confidently proclaimed that the site was non-African. Later, carbon dating and material analysis proved beyond doubt that Great Zimbabwe was built by local Shona-speaking peoples between the 11th and 15th centuries. But for decades, the myth of foreign builders persisted, a manufactured denial of African achievement. Similar distortions occurred with the manuscripts of Timbuktu. When French colonialists entered Mali in the late 19th century, they found libraries containing thousands of texts on astronomy, medicine, law, and poetry. Yet many were confiscated, smuggled to Europe, or left neglected. Colonial scholars dismissed them as derivative of Arab or Persian work, refusing to acknowledge African authorship. Only in recent decades, through digitization projects and scholarly re-evaluations, have these texts been recognized as a uniquely African intellectual tradition. Academic gatekeeping reinforced the silences. Anthropology, archaeology, and history, disciplines that should have preserved knowledge, often became tools of empire. Early anthropologists described African myths and oral traditions as primitive superstition rather than sophisticated systems of memory. Archaeologists prioritized Greco-Roman remains while ignoring African sites. Even in the mid-20th century, many Western universities offered African studies not as a serious historical field, but as an extension of colonial administration, focusing on ethnography useful for governance rather than history valuable in its own right. Museums tell another story of erasure. The Benin bronzes, exquisite metal plaques and sculptures from the Kingdom of Benin, in present-day Nigeria, were looted in 1897 during a British punitive expedition. Thousands were shipped to Europe, where they were displayed as curiosities in museums. For decades, labels claimed they were the work of unknown or foreign artists, denying their African origin. Only later, when technical analysis of casting methods confirmed local innovation, were they acknowledged as masterpieces of African metallurgy. Even so, most remain in European institutions, divorced from their cultural context. Scientific tools now expose how extensive this gatekeeping was. Comparative analysis of trade goods, Chinese porcelain in inland Africa, glass beads from India, coins from the Islamic world, confirms Africa's deep integration into global trade. Yet these artifacts were often catalogued as imports rather than evidence of African participation. Colonial narratives framed Africans as passive recipients of influence, never as active creators of networks. This bias shaped not just museums, but the very way global history was told. The silencing also reached into education. Colonial-era textbooks in Africa taught young students that civilization began in Mesopotamia, flourished in Greece, and reached its peak in Europe. African contributions were either omitted or presented as minor. Oral traditions were excluded entirely. A 1930s textbook used in British West Africa devoted only a few pages to African kingdoms, portraying them as curiosities rather than central actors in history. These narratives lingered long after independence, leaving generations unaware of the full depth of their heritage. But erasure was never total. Local communities resisted, sometimes quietly, sometimes defiantly. In Mali, families hid manuscripts under earthen floors, passing them down in secret. In Zimbabwe, oral traditions of the Shona people preserved the memory of their ancestors building Great Zimbabwe, even as official archaeology denied it. In Nigeria, descendants of Benin artisans remembered the techniques of bronze casting, even when the masterpieces themselves were displayed in foreign museums. These acts of resistance ensured that fragments of truth survived, waiting to be rediscovered. What makes this history haunting is how deliberate the silences were. Colonial officials understood that controlling memory meant controlling identity. By erasing Africa's past, they justified its domination. By denying its civilizations, they claimed the continent had nothing to lose and everything to gain from colonial progress. The distortion of history became a weapon as powerful as rifles and cannons, and yet the ruins still stood. The manuscripts still whispered. The symbols still spoke through myth and song. Even under centuries of suppression, Africa's history endured like a buried ember, waiting for new hands to uncover it. The age of erasure leads us inevitably to the age of rediscovery. Today, archaeology, genetics, and satellite imaging are peeling back layers of distortion, revealing a past too vast to be silenced. What was once dismissed as myth is being confirmed as history, and what was hidden is re-emerging into the light. For centuries, much of Africa's history was buried beneath layers of distortion, silence, or outright denial. But in recent decades, a new chapter has opened. Armed with tools that can pierce jungles, read invisible texts, and analyze ancient DNA, modern science is rediscovering Africa's forgotten empires. The ruins that once stood as mysteries are now being mapped, dated, and understood in ways earlier generations could never have imagined. What was dismissed as myth is proving to be history. What was erased is being restored. One of the most powerful tools in this rediscovery is LiDAR, light detection and ranging. By sending laser pulses from aircraft, LiDAR creates 3D maps that strip away vegetation. In Central and East Africa, it has revealed hidden settlement patterns, road systems, and terracing long obscured by forest cover. Studies around the Congo Basin and Great Lakes have uncovered networks of habitation far larger than previously believed, showing that ancient populations managed landscapes at continental scale. What colonial maps once depicted as empty wilderness is now revealed as a palimpsest of farms, towns, and ceremonial sites. At Great Zimbabwe, drones and ground-penetrating radar have uncovered previously unseen enclosures beneath the soil. These scans suggest the city may have been even larger and more complex than earlier excavations revealed. In Ethiopia, remote sensing has traced Aksumite roads and aqueducts buried under centuries of erosion, highlighting the infrastructural sophistication of an empire once compared to Rome. Digital modelling of Aksum's obelisks has also shown the extraordinary precision with which they were carved and transported, sparking new debates about ancient engineering. Genetics has become another frontier. DNA analysis of ancient human remains is beginning to map out Africa's deep population history. A 2017 study sequenced genomes from East Africa and found links to populations in the Middle East and South Asia, confirming long-suspected patterns of migration and trade. Other studies of West African remains reveal genetic continuity with modern populations, underscoring how the builders of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai were not lost peoples, but ancestors of communities still alive today. Mitochondrial DNA also traces ancient female lineages across the Sahel and East Africa, suggesting that women played crucial roles in transmitting both genes and cultural practices across regions. Archaeology continues to produce startling finds. Excavations at Mapungubwe and Great Zimbabwe have yielded gold ornaments, ceramics, and glass beads that isotope analysis traces to India, Persia, and even China. At coastal Kilwa, divers have recovered anchor stones and ceramics pointing to centuries of maritime exchange. In Timbuktu, conservation projects are not only protecting manuscripts, but also studying them with cutting-edge technology. Multispectral imaging has revealed faded words invisible to the naked eye, restoring lost passages on astronomy, mathematics, and law. Some texts even contain diagrams of lunar cycles and planetary positions, showing African scholars engaged in scientific debates parallel to their contemporaries in Europe and the Middle East. Climate science adds another dimension. Cores drilled from African lakes reveal layers of sediment that act as time capsules of rainfall and drought. Pollen grains trapped in mud tell us what crops were grown and when. These records show cycles of climate stress that coincide with shifts in power. Prolonged droughts during the 14th century may have weakened Mali, while fluctuations in rainfall shaped the rise and fall of Great Zimbabwe. Such studies prove that Africa's empires were not static but dynamic, responding to the rhythms of environment as much as politics. Digital archives are also reshaping access to knowledge. Thousands of Timbuktu manuscripts have been scanned and made available online, breaking centuries of isolation. Scholars can now read African legal codes, poetry, and medical treatises without leaving their desks. Families in Mali, once the secret guardians of manuscripts, are now partners in global preservation. For the first time, the world can see Africa not as oral only, but as a continent with both spoken and written traditions of great depth. Perhaps the most striking rediscoveries are the intangible ones. Oral traditions, long dismissed, are now being revisited with scientific respect. Climate records match with myths of drought and flood. Archaeological layers align with griot epics of migration and war. What was once called legend is proving to be historical memory encoded in narrative form. The Dogon story of Sirius B may remain debated, but the fact that oral traditions can encode ecological and astronomical knowledge is no longer in doubt. Taken together, these rediscoveries dismantle the colonial silences. They show Africa not as a land without history, but as a continent of innovation, trade, scholarship, and resilience. The picture that emerges is not one of isolation, but of interconnectedness. Empires tied into global networks long before Europe's expansion. Scientific tools have not given Africa its history. They have simply allowed us to hear what was always there. And yet, even as technology reveals the past, a question lingers. Who tells the story now? Will these discoveries be absorbed into a global narrative still centered on Europe, or will they empower Africans to reclaim their own past? Rediscovery is not only about science, it is about narrative, identity, and justice. At sunrise in Aksum, the obelisks cast long shadows across the earth, just as they did over 1,000 years ago. In Timbuktu, manuscripts wrapped in cloth and hidden under floorboards for centuries are now being carefully digitized. In Zimbabwe, the conical tower still rises from the great enclosure, silent yet unbroken. These places remind us that Africa's past was never lost, only hidden. The challenge today is not discovery alone, but reclamation. The future of history depends on whose voices are allowed to tell it. Reclaiming the narrative begins with education. Across Africa, universities and schools are rewriting curricula that once centered on Mesopotamia, Greece, and Rome, while relegating African civilizations to footnotes. In Ghana, students now study the Adinkra symbols as systems of philosophy. In Ethiopia, history courses connect Aksum's legacy to modern national identity. In Mali, digital copies of Timbuktu's manuscripts are being used to teach mathematics and astronomy from indigenous sources. These shifts are not nostalgia, they are rebalancing. They return agency to the people who are the heirs of these empires. Museums are also at the forefront of this change. The debate over the Benin bronzes illustrates the shift in consciousness. For more than a century, these masterpieces were displayed in London, Berlin, and Paris, stripped of their context. Today, pressure for repatriation has grown stronger, and some bronzes have begun to return to Nigeria. In Benin City, new museums are being built to house them, curated by local experts. This act of return is more than restitution, it is symbolic restoration. It signals that the guardianship of Africa's heritage is shifting back into African hands. Technology continues to amplify these efforts. Remote sensing reveals ruins previously unknown. DNA analysis connects ancient populations to living communities, affirming continuity rather than rupture. But equally powerful is the rise of digital archives. Thousands of pages of Timbuktu manuscripts are now freely accessible online, and community-based projects ensure local ownership of the knowledge. In South Africa, 3D scans of Mapungubwe's artifacts allow replicas to be displayed in schools and community centres, giving ordinary citizens access to treasures once locked in vaults. This democratization of heritage is a form of narrative reclamation because it refuses to let history remain the property of a few. Oral traditions, too, are being honoured anew. Griots and storytellers are recording their epics for digital preservation, ensuring that memory will not fade even if voices are silenced. Researchers now treat oral histories as valid historical sources, correlating them with archaeology and climate science. In this way, the old silences are being broken, replaced with layered narratives where myth and science speak together. But reclaiming the narrative also means confronting the lingering effects of colonial erasure. Many African youths still grow up hearing more about Rome than about Songhai, more about Greece than about Great Zimbabwe. Correcting this imbalance requires more than textbooks. It demands a cultural shift. Films, novels, music, and art are increasingly drawing on African history as inspiration. From Afrofuturism in literature to blockbuster films that reimagine African kingdoms as global powers, popular culture is reclaiming spaces once dominated by foreign myths. These creative expressions are not escapism, they are reassertions of presence. Globally, too, the narrative is shifting. Historians and archaeologists now argue that to understand world history, one must include Africa at its centre, not its margins. The gold of Mali, the scholarship of Timbuktu, the trade of the Swahili coast, the engineering of Great Zimbabwe, these were not peripheral contributions, but vital threads in the global tapestry. Recognizing this changes not only how we see Africa, but how we see ourselves as humans. The recurring motif of missing pages finds resolution here. Pages once torn away are being rewritten, not with ink alone, but with voices, scans, performances, and memory. The story of humanity is incomplete without Africa's empires, and each recovery brings the whole picture into sharper focus. The future of the past, then, is not silence but chorus. It is the voices of scholars, griots, communities, and scientists speaking together. It is obelisks and manuscripts, songs and stones, woven back into a single fabric. To reclaim the narrative is not only to honour Africa, but to heal history itself. Where are you listening from tonight, and at what time? Perhaps you too are part of this unfolding, witnesses to the return of stories long hidden. If these mysteries move you, consider subscribing, so that together we can keep turning the pages once thought lost. The empires of Africa were never lost. They were waiting,